Welcome to Truth Behind History, the channel where we dive deep into the stories behind history's most legendary figures. Today, we're uncovering the hidden layers of a man who is often remembered as a war hero, but who was so much more. You've heard the speeches, you've seen the famous photos, and you know his role in World War II. But Winston Churchill wasn't just a wartime leader, he was an artist, a writer, a strategist, and a man full of contradictions. His private life was filled with eccentric habits, creative passions, and deep struggles. And perhaps most interestingly, he played a key role in shaping his own legacy, ensuring that history remembered him exactly the way he wanted. So, who was the real Winston Churchill? Was he a fearless leader, a brilliant mind, a deeply flawed man, or all of the above? Stick around as we peel back the layers of history to reveal the secret life of Winston Churchill. Now, when you think of Winston Churchill, the image that probably comes to mind is a man in a sharp suit, cigar in hand, giving a rousing wartime speech. But did you know that in his free time, he was also an artist? And not just someone who dabbled in painting, Churchill created over 500 works of art in his lifetime. He discovered painting in his 40s, turning to it not just as a hobby, but as a lifeline. Churchill suffered from what he called his "the black dog," a term he used for depression. When the pressures of political life became overwhelming, he would retreat into the world of colors and canvases. Painting wasn't just an escape, it was a way for him to quiet his mind, to focus, and to find a sense of peace. His style leaned toward Impressionism, and he was particularly fond of landscapes. Rolling hills, serene lakes, and grand estates filled his canvases, far from the chaos of war and politics. But here's the most interesting part: Churchill didn't always paint under his real name. At times, he exhibited his works under a pseudonym to see if his paintings could stand on their own, without the weight of his famous name behind them. And they did. Some even received critical acclaim. So, while the world remembers Churchill as a war leader, he also left behind a stunning collection of artwork, proof that even the most powerful figures in history had creative souls. If you thought Churchill's only talent was painting, think again. He was also a writer, a prolific one at that. In fact, Churchill wrote over 40 books in his lifetime, covering history, politics, and even his own personal experiences. He didn't just lead armies, he wrote about them. He didn't just make history, he documented it. His mastery of language wasn't just for books, it played a crucial role in his political career. His speeches were legendary, full of powerful rhetoric that could rally a nation. He had a way of making words feel like weapons, sharp, impactful, and unforgettable. But Churchill didn't just write because he enjoyed it. Writing was his survival. Despite his status, he wasn't always financially secure, and his writing helped him maintain his lavish lifestyle. The man had expensive tastes, cigars, fine food, luxury travel, and his books and articles were a way to fund it all. His skill with words was so great that in 1953, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. That's right, Winston Churchill wasn't just a war hero, he was a Nobel Prize-winning author, and his writing still shapes how we understand history today. So whether it was leading a nation, painting a masterpiece, or crafting a gripping historical account, Churchill knew how to leave his mark. Now, let's step away from Churchill's public persona and dive into his private life. Because let's be honest, history is always more interesting when we get a glimpse at the quirks that made these figures human. And Churchill? He had plenty of them. First up, he had a rather unconventional approach to work. Forget the idea of a statesman in a formal office. Churchill preferred to conduct business from bed, literally. He would often wake up, stay in his pajamas, light up a cigar, and begin dictating speeches or letters to his secretaries without even getting up. Imagine being his assistant, showing up first thing in the morning only to find your boss still in his nightwear, puffing away on a cigar, and barking out instructions for wartime strategy. But it doesn't stop there. Churchill also had a habit of holding meetings in the bathtub. Yes, you heard that right. Some of the most important discussions of his career took place while he was soaking in the tub. Imagine being a high-ranking official, walking into the Prime Minister's quarters, only to be greeted by Churchill, submerged in bubbles, ready to talk politics. And then there were his naps. Churchill swore by his strict nap schedule. He believed that taking an afternoon nap wasn't just a luxury, but a necessity. In fact, he claimed that his midday rest allowed him to work nearly double the amount of hours in a day. He treated napping as a strategic advantage, giving him the stamina to keep up his famously demanding lifestyle. So while most leaders relied on rigid discipline and early mornings, Churchill found success in a routine that most people would consider downright bizarre. But hey, it worked for him. Winston Churchill wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of action. And some of his plans were so bold, so ambitious, that they sound like something straight out of a spy novel. First, let's talk about Operation Unthinkable. The name alone tells you everything. This was Churchill's secret plan to attack the Soviet Union right after World War II. Yes, you heard that right. The same Soviet Union that had just been Britain's ally in defeating Nazi Germany. Churchill saw Stalin as the next big threat to Europe and was convinced that if the West didn't act fast, the Soviets would become too powerful to stop. His plan involved using British and American forces, along with German troops who had just surrendered, to push the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. The only problem? The idea was, well, unthinkable. The plan was shut down almost immediately because it would have led to another catastrophic war right on the heels of World War II. Then there were his nuclear ambitions. Churchill understood early on that nuclear weapons were going to change the world. He was one of the first leaders to push for Britain to develop its own nuclear arsenal, making sure the country wouldn't fall behind in what would later become the Cold War arms race. He saw nuclear weapons as a way to maintain British power in a world where empires were crumbling. And let's not forget Churchill's love for unconventional warfare. He was a big believer in guerrilla tactics, espionage, and intelligence-driven strategies. He supported sabotage missions behind enemy lines, helped form the Special Operations Executive, a British group that carried out secret missions in occupied Europe, and even encouraged the use of deception tactics to trick enemy forces. Churchill wasn't just a military leader, he was a strategist who believed in fighting wars in ways that no one saw coming. Some of his ideas were ahead of their time. Others, like Operation Unthinkable, were simply too extreme to ever happen. But one thing is certain, Churchill was always thinking one step ahead. For all his larger-than-life qualities, Churchill was a man who battled demons that few people saw. Beneath the image of the fearless leader and the sharp-witted orator, there was a man struggling with deep, personal pain. Churchill suffered from what he called his black dog, a term he used to describe his episodes of depression. This wasn't just occasional sadness or stress. Churchill's mood swings were well documented, and many historians believe he suffered from clinical depression. At times, he would sink into long periods of despair, where even his greatest achievements felt hollow. He would isolate himself, consumed by dark thoughts, and it was during these times that he turned to his coping mechanisms. One of his greatest escapes was painting. He once said, "When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first million years in painting." For Churchill, art wasn't just a hobby, it was therapy. The act of painting allowed him to focus, to silence the noise in his mind, and to pull himself out of the abyss. Then there was writing. Churchill poured his thoughts onto paper, sometimes as a form of catharsis, other times as a way to reassert control over his own narrative. He may not have been able to control his emotions, but he could control the way history remembered him. And, of course, there was alcohol. Churchill had a well-known fondness for whiskey, brandy, and champagne. He drank throughout the day, often beginning with a diluted whiskey in the morning and ending the night with a strong nightcap. Some say it was a coping mechanism, a way to numb his struggles. Others argue that it was simply part of his personality, an extension of his love for excess. But despite all this, Churchill maintained an image of resilience. In public, he was strong, determined, and unwavering. His speeches were full of defiance and energy, but privately, he fought constant battles with himself. He carried the weight of leadership and history on his shoulders, all while wrestling with the darkness inside him. Churchill was a man who led nations, inspired millions, and shaped history, but he was also human. And like so many great minds, his brilliance came with struggles that history often overlooks. Winston Churchill is often remembered as a wartime hero, but history isn't so black and white. While he played a crucial role in leading Britain through World War II, some of his decisions left a far more complicated legacy, one that remains the subject of debate to this day. First, let's talk about his colonial policies. Churchill was a staunch defender of the British Empire. He believed in Britain's right to rule over its colonies and was deeply opposed to independence movements. While other politicians began to recognize the changing tide of history, Churchill held firm, refusing to accept that Britain's empire was fading. He dismissed calls for Indian independence and took a hard stance against self-rule in many of Britain's territories. To Churchill, the empire wasn't just a political entity, it was an identity, a force for civilization, and something worth preserving at all costs. But this hardline approach had devastating consequences. The Bengal famine of 1943 is one of the most tragic events linked to Churchill's policies. During World War II, a severe famine struck Bengal, now part of modern-day India and Bangladesh, leading to the deaths of millions. While multiple factors contributed to the crisis, Churchill's government refused to divert food supplies to the region, prioritizing stockpiling resources for the war effort. When Indian officials pleaded for aid, Churchill reportedly made callous remarks, blaming the famine on what he saw as India's high birth rate rather than a lack of food. This disaster remains one of the darkest stains on his legacy. Then there's his divisive reputation. Churchill was, and still is, a celebrated figure in Britain and the West, hailed as the man who stood up to Hitler when the world needed it most. But in former British colonies, his name evokes a different kind of memory, one tied to imperialism, oppression, and policies that left lasting scars. So was Churchill a hero or a symbol of British imperialism? The truth, as always, is complex. He was both a visionary leader and a man bound by the beliefs of his time, and history continues to wrestle with his legacy. Winston Churchill didn't just shape history, he shaped how history would remember him. Few leaders have been as aware of their own legacy as Churchill was. He wasn't just a politician or a wartime leader, he was a master of self-mythologizing, carefully crafting his public image to ensure that future generations would see him the way he wanted to be seen. First, he shaped his own story through his speeches and books. Churchill wasn't content to let historians define his legacy, he took control of the narrative himself. He wrote extensively about his own life, ensuring that the story of his leadership, his struggles, and his triumphs was told on his own terms. His writings painted him as a man of unshakable resolve, a lone figure standing against the tide of history, refusing to surrender in the face of tyranny. But here's the interesting part: Churchill wasn't just a hero, he was also a villain in the eyes of many. He is praised for his wartime leadership, yet criticized for his imperialist policies. His speeches inspired millions, yet his decisions had devastating consequences in other parts of the world. He embodies the complexity of historical figures, neither entirely good nor entirely bad, but something in between. And yet, his influence remains undeniable. Churchill is one of the most studied, quoted, and debated figures in history. His words continue to inspire politicians, military leaders, and ordinary people. His legacy isn't just a story of war, it's a story of power, ambition, and the ability to shape one's own place in history. Churchill may be gone, but his legend lives on. The question is, how much of that legend was built by history, and how much of it was built by Churchill himself? So, after peeling back the layers of Winston Churchill's life, what do we find? A man of contradictions, a leader who was both brilliant and deeply flawed, a strategist, an artist, a writer, and a political titan who defied simple categorization. Churchill's enduring influence is undeniable. His leadership during World War II made him a symbol of resilience and defiance. His speeches still echo through history, his writings continue to shape how we understand the past, and his impact on global politics is still felt today. But at the same time, his legacy is complicated. He was a hero to many, but a symbol of oppression to others. He fought against tyranny in Europe, yet defended British colonial rule elsewhere. He inspired nations, yet struggled privately with his own battles. He was a man of extraordinary vision, yet bound by the prejudices and politics of his era. And that's what makes Churchill such a fascinating figure. He wasn't perfect, no historical figure ever is. But whether you see him as a champion of democracy, an architect of empire, or something in between, one thing is certain: Winston Churchill remains one of the most debated and complex figures in modern history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Churchill's secret life, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more history content. And if you love learning about history's untold stories, check out our other videos, you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Truth Behind History.